The following podcast is brought to you by CDKOffers.com. Use offer code DIESHRINK for 3% off everything on the website and Broken Silicon for 25% off all Windows codes. All right, on with the show. And welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I'm your host, Tom, and this is the 24th most popular tech podcast in Kuwait, 28th in Belgium. As usual, as I've been doing lately, giving a shout out to the countries that jump up the charts the most in a given week. But enough of that randomness. I'll let my guest introduce himself right now.
So, hey everyone, I'm product manager for commercial notebooks, and day to day, it's all about making a lot of decisions for the local market, and also helping, the sales team excel in what they do. I'm there to support a lot of the business that gets done, but also make a lot of decisions around the product, how it's brought in, what the forecasts are like. And I'm also involved in some PR and sort of customer facing activities as well. Not as many, these days with the global pandemic going on, but there is still an element of that. So it's really varied, which I appreciate. And it gives me a lot of hands-on time in, stuff that I am interested in, right? Which is a lot of the technology side of the business.
And I actually do want to try to drill down a little bit on this to give people, and because we got a mountain of reader mails that we'll be getting to. Some of them I think are really good. Like, what actual decisions do you make on a laptop product that your company wants to launch? Like, what are you actually touching in the process? What are you what's a literal decision you've made?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it really comes down to marketing and product fundamentals around, looking at data in terms of, looking at the market, how many of, X type of product is made, or forecasting decision, right, based on trends. A lot of decisions around how the products are maybe shown or merchandised locally, pricing to a lesser extent. It's a very large organization, so there's a lot of people that handle a lot of aspects that relate to it. And a lot of sort of what we call enablement for sales, right? Like I said, making them excel at their job, in terms of getting back to customer queries, working on, large tenders for customers. There's a lot of very nebulous aspects, but I guess a big part of it is being like a technical resource, what we call a subject matter expert.
Right. Because when, I think this is something a lot of people, like if you don't work at either a computer company or something that makes something that's a complex mechanical or electronic device that a lot of people buy, it's hard to kind of understand just how many hands actually go into not just saying making the product probably wouldn't even be the right way to put it. But I think the way you might put it is getting a product from start to the finish line, right? That's kind of what your goal is. I mean, what your job is, isn't it? Like, you're not the guy in AutoCAD designing the chassis of a laptop. You're not someone, who designed the PCB. You're kind of someone who's there from start to finish, aren't you? Kind of communicating with all of these different teams and making sure it launches on time. Am I correct?
A good way to think about it is like a timeline. And there's, the very start is sort of like very early concept, where you're sketching out rough ideas, and then that sort of gets solidified into something a bit closer to reality, and then that might actually get some actual designs around it, and that'll get nipped and tweaked and tucked by a different team, and so on. And you keep going down the pipeline. I'm kind of near the end, right? I kind of sit directly behind the sales force that actually sell the product. But I do give feedback on, product performance, maybe customer feedback in terms of feature set, what's important, what isn't. And sometimes, that can get directly addressed in design changes and tweaks. Other times, that sort of gets fed up the chain, and it sort of adds to the weight around a specific decision that might not be made for another year or two.
Right. So I guess let's start moving forward with some more of these discussion points. Then the first thing, to just kind of dive into, the whole laptop OEM conversation is, I think, let's talk about how COVID-19 pandemic has affected the industry in general. Early this year, between March and April, what were the challenges you had to face? And you can, it can be as general or specific as you want to your day-to-day work. What challenges did you see at your, workplace when this started all happening?
Great question. So, it's probably worth mentioning before we start that all these views are my own and not of my employers. I guess depends on where you are in the world, first of all.
Yeah.
Because some countries locked down really quickly because they were, directly affected, or they had, very close ties to China. So they had to take swift action. Other countries like the US, they stopped travel from entire regions to do what they could to mitigate it early on. So if you're in one of those regions that locked down pretty severely, there was a massive scramble by businesses to purchase mobility devices for their staff to relocate. Some companies were more or less ready to go, Others had maybe the bones of the capability, but they needed to expand that. I have a friend who works in a government organization, and when they were sent home to work remotely, the first 48 hours was kind of chaos because their VPN could only accept 300 concurrent connections. And when you've got a staff of 3,000, that isn't going to fly, right? So I think it exposed huge gaps in remote capability for a lot of workforces. There's also a lot of security implications around having all your staff working remotely.
Yeah.
And, if your security was focused on, locking down and controlling your local network, but not necessarily, the remote devices, there's some ugly questions that get raised that I think a lot of IT managers had to face some hard truths around. Geez, we've got to open the checkbook and spend a lot of money quickly.
I remember the place I worked for. I already, I was an account manager, who worked remotely in Peoria, to be close to some of the businesses here in central Illinois and around that area of the Midwest. So I was already working remotely for my company, right? But then there were a lot of people in our company that frankly already had the laptops. But then there were some others where they were just used to using like a desktop for design, or they had the laptop, but they didn't have anything else, right? And their Wi-Fi wasn't good at home. And I remember in the first couple of weeks, there was just a ton of this, like everyone was trying to work, but there were days where everyone was clearly like, yeah, we're not going to be able to get anything done today, are we? Like it was really interesting to watch. I know some people's businesses were just, if they weren't already, if they didn't already have half the people working from home, like you, as the example you gave, they were just, nothing got done for about 2 weeks. So Johnny Turbo writes in, and just like you guys can if you support us on Patreon, and he goes, we provide IT services for a small business, and many of them have been wanting laptops with docking stations over desktops during this pandemic. They can have the big screen and the peripherals in the office and still have all their files, apps on the go. Have you seen similar trends, and do you have any insight as to what we can expect from future docking station technology? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's been happening for a while, the whole docking to have a desktop-like experience with a notebook. All the major vendors have USB Type-C or Thunderbolt docks available. And they all roughly have the same capability. Some might charge faster than others or have more ports, but at the end of the day, they give you that same experience, right? Which is what matters. And we might see an acceleration in that in terms of more users are utilizing notebooks, but they still require that desktop experience, but from home. And you've touched on some of your experience as well, where not everybody has the same internet connection at home. Not everybody has the space for a home office. How do you handle that? And there isn't always an easy answer to a lot of those questions. Look, I think the trend in the market has been that majority of purchases are laptops, and that'll continue to be the case. I think in most markets around the world, that's the case. Docking stations, the commercial ones especially, aren't cheap. You can buy, a fairly cheap one from Belkin or Targus for $100 or $200, and that's fine, but it might not have charging capability in it, or it might not have, a lot of bandwidth for plugging in lots of screens. So that's where the commercial docks are a fair bit more expensive, but they give you that extra capability. And they're also can be remotely managed as well quite often by the company's IT, right? Again, you don't get that kind of capability in consumer devices. So I mean that's where I think we'll just continue to move in that direction. I don't think docking station technology is going to fundamentally change that much. The one big change we had was moving from proprietary docks to USB-C docking.
Yeah, that kind of changes everything, right? Funny how there was this big, am I wrong? Like, I feel like about 5 or 6 years ago, there was this big push from like HP and Dell and other major OEMs to have this proprietary dock for a business laptop that, I remember specifically HP would have this like almost PCIe connection open up on the bottom of a business laptop, and this like thing would just plug into the bottom of it, and then there's all your ports. But when you have like a Thunderbolt port, you can just have a dongle that has like 6 USB connections and an HDMI at the same time. So you almost like what you would call a docking station almost seems obsolete at this point to me.
Yeah, all the major OEMs had them. They were kind of clunky. Yeah, they all used like sort of an older style PCIe proprietary connection that would literally click into the side or the bottom of the notebook. Some vendors did try to do interesting things, like Lenovo had one that had a discrete graphics card inside of it.
Yeah.
For the notebook. I thought that was pretty cool.
I always loved that as an idea, but I don't remember it ever catching on or ever being implemented in a way that was truly the fullest potential, from my perspective.
Yeah, there were some advantages with the older docks where quite often the connection was a lot more secure, right? And you could literally lock the dock, so you couldn't remove the laptop from the dock. How important that is, I don't know.
But so I guess kind of going back on subject, though, for this reader mail question and this next discussion point, I think a lot of people, at least I saw in gaming forums online when this lockdown happened, for a lot of people assumed, so people can't go anywhere, so maybe desktops will start taking market share back from laptops. And in fact, right, the opposite has happened. Even though people are arguably moving around less, they actually want their computer to be more mobile more. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely on the head. I think it was pretty obvious, and it was widely reported early on that there was a huge surge in purchasing of notebooks from all the major vendors because, while a desktop is your best bang for buck device, it has great performance. Even a basic i3 or an i5 desktop will be a fair amount faster than most notebooks you can buy, relatively speaking, right? For a similar amount of money. A notebook, it's a device that has everything built into it, right? It has a screen, keyboard, touchpad, it has a webcam, it has microphones. If you don't even have a headset, you can still participate in collaboration with your colleagues. Whereas with a desktop, not everybody has a home office with a big desk for a desktop and a screen and all that. I've got colleagues that worked in their dining room tables and kind of still do in a few cases because they just don't have the space. So imagine giving that person a desktop and a keyboard and a mouse and like, I don't know, like a 24-inch screen and then expect them to set it up somewhere, right? It's just not going to work.
And if you ship all these things to them, what if most things arrive, but then like the mouse didn't get to their house, right? At the same time, like
that wouldn't be helpful.
Like from a logistical perspective, I can see why if you're a business, it's just like, look, I know if I give them this laptop, they technically have everything they need right when they turn it on. And the support we can give them from IT is this device. We know what camera you're using. We know what mic you're using. We know what mouth, and so the support is a lot easier to do effectively centralized, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't realize or understand like how fundamentally critical that is ease of management. That's a big decision in how IT products are deployed and managed or even chosen to begin with. And that's a really important factor when it comes to choosing what device for your employees to use, right? So, deploying a bunch of consumer devices that you might not be able to remotely manage out of band, that becomes very challenging to deal with in this sort of decentralized situation we're in at the moment in a lot of markets.
So, what would you say is the point of a desktop for a business? Because the more I've talked to you and other people, it seems pretty clear to me that they were already on this trend to switch to mostly laptops. And it sounds like in the future, that's just accelerating now. I mean, what do desktops remain to be used for businesses?
A lot of use cases are where you need fixed computing in a situation that employees have a particular workstation they sit down to work at. So I don't say workstation in the high performance sense. I say workstation is in like the actual place sense. So think a call center, right? It's a perfect go-to example for a desktop. Quite often, high schools or colleges that have computer labs, it's another great example. Yeah. I mean, look, that said, right, laptops have gotten vastly better as well, probably just in the last 3 to 5 years in terms of their speed and capability. Gone are the days where you'd have a laptop that would take 15 minutes to boot and, battery life was 1 or 2 hours, right? They've come a long way.
Well, let's get into that then. So, I mean, can we go 10 years back to or more to 2009 and what you remember about, kind of managing laptop design back then?
Sure. I mean, back then I was literally selling the product, but absolutely, I do remember not necessarily fondly of, what laptops were like back then. And it almost seems a bit crazy in terms of what we put up with. And I'm only talking 10 years ago. If you go back even further, it was even more
just
ridiculous.
15. It's to the point. It's honestly to the point of hilarity. Like how truly, bad laptops were. I mean, I'll just speak for myself. My first laptop that I got kind of for 3D modeling and gaming, when I went to college was, I actually thought it had a pretty nice screen, but I think it was like a 19.5-inch screen. So it was enormous. I don't even know if they make, I'm sure someone does, but they even make laptops that big anymore. I think they usually max out at about 18.5 now. It was this kind of gorgeous for the time. I'm sure it's junk now if I were to look at it. 19.5-inch screen. And then I had to decide between a 70-watt quad core at 2 gigahertz, or with no hyper-threading, of course, because we're in the Core 2 era, or a dual core at 3 gigahertz. And I chose the dual core because at the time games didn't really use more than 2 cores. And that thing got so bloody hot, I had to send it back twice because literally the plastic was melting. There were burn and warped plastic on the top of the laptop. It had to be sent in for repair twice because of that. And I think the strongest graphics cards were Now they're putting like 2080 Supers that are underclocked in laptops. And back then, the biggest you'd get, I believe, was like a 60 class, so like a GTX 460, and it would be clocked like half speed. Like I'm saying like 300 megahertz for some of those mobile graphics cards. And then it would melt your laptop. So I don't know if you remember just how many overheating problems you had to deal with when you were selling those.
Definitely when it came to cramming high performance components and laptops back then, they were highly compromised, and spending $5,000 on a gaming notebook back then definitely did not give you what I would consider is a $5,000 experience, especially when you compare to what you could get on a desktop at the same time for like $2,000, right? So it's almost like the performance you get for the dollar has vastly improved on notebooks. Maybe not to the same extent on desktops. I mean, yes, it's vastly improved,
but it's almost comparable sometimes, right? Like it's
exactly.
Sometimes you can get an insane laptop deal. Like I saw, what was it? Just the other day, I was looking at laptops because I want to be able to do truly high performance editing on the go now. I found a Razer laptop on eBay for $2,500, not used yet, brand new, that has a 2080 Super and an 8-core processor. And I mean, for $2,500, and I understand it's $1,000 cheaper than it usually is, but that's comparable to a high-end gaming desktop.
Definitely, yeah.
Do you remember an example of a what you would put in, I put in air quotes, high performance notebook was over 10 years ago that was a decent seller? Like what were its specs? Do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, definitely this was back in the day where, having a gig of RAM or more was considered a lot. Yeah, so at the time, budget notebooks had under a gig of RAM.
Mm-hmm.
I think most systems would have sort of 2 to 4. And anything beyond that was considered like pretty damn good. But I mean, this is also very much still in the days of 32-bit Windows. And that whole shift to 64-bit was starting to happen, but wasn't quite there. So there wasn't always a lot of point going beyond 4 gig of memory. Mechanical hard drives obviously were king. SSDs were still a glimmer on the horizon, but not really there. So yeah. I mean,
they existed, but they were kind of like fawned over for 32 gigabytes as a boot drive or something.
Well, I mean, we saw sort of the early eMMC drives in netbooks around that time. Lots of them shipped with 16 or 32 gig eMMC drives. But yeah, I mean, it was a big deal to upgrade from the standard 4,200 RPM drive in your laptop to a 5,400 or even the high performance 7,200 RPM. Again, it's just crazy when you think about like how slow some of these components were in terms of holding back the entire system. But there was really nothing you could do without spending frankly, thousands of dollars on something cutting edge like a 64 gig solid state drive from Intel. But I think those only came out a few years later, like the first consumer SSDs.
And I don't mean to overdwell on how bad these components were, but I think a lot of people, I remember the debates in like Tom's Hardware forums of like when SSDs were still just ungodly expensive, and they were going, so should I get this $300? I think the discussion was, should I get this $300 10,000 RPM Raptor drive or this $400 SSD that's a fourth the capacity? I can't decide. And like actually, like, oh, but can I cool the hard drive well enough? And like, those were the decisions we were making.
Yeah, those things ran hot. And RAID 0 hard drives for a while was like, if you wanted the best performance, you had to do that. Just had to do it.
Yeah, and I remember, and so going back to laptops, though, that laptop I had, that AutoCAD laptop, was like, I'm going to be honest, man. I think its battery life was about 70 minutes. Like even just turning down the brightness all the way, not playing any games. Like it could barely, I don't even know if it could finish an entire movie on the airplane, like if I flew somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of improvements on that side, although there's still notebooks, out there in the market that it's not a huge challenge to find that you'll still only get an hour or an hour and a half of battery life on. But
I'll say it's rare to find one that's under 2 now, I think. And now if you're gaming, who knows? But,
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm referring to those truly desktop in a laptop form factor devices that are just absurd. But when it comes to battery life, there's been huge improvements there. Quite often it's down to, I guess, better efficiency of components. So batteries themselves haven't improved fundamentally, hugely, other than the move to the prismatic batteries away from like the coin sort of style, where it's like a barrel, what you call like the old barrel batteries, right?
Yes.
Where the battery cells were literally like a barrel shape versus the prismatic ones that are like a flat sort of rectangular shape that can be sort of shaped a little bit into like the nooks and crannies in a notebook. That allowed, a lot of manufacturers to get more battery capacity in like a thin and light laptop and just more efficiently use the space inside. Like, we've seen the same thing with mobile phones. But the battery capacities, they maybe have gone up a little bit because of that, but they fundamentally haven't changed significantly. It's like I said, it's the efficiency of all the other components getting better. It's switchable graphics actually working. It's the move to the 15-watt U-class CPUs as the mainstream CPU. It used to not be the case. It used to be the H-class style 35, 45-watt processor. That was what you got in every laptop.
Well, let's back up a little bit then. When did you see the start of this switch to more? When did you see things start to really change? Like what year roughly? Where did the laptops start to finally get decent battery lives and, frankly put, just not suck anymore?
Yeah, that was back around probably 2011, 2012. Intel did a big push around the brand new brand they brought to market called Ultrabook, right? And all the vendors made Ultrabook products. And, there were lots of things that went into an Ultrabook. But the main thing was that they leveraged these lower power CPUs that had pretty decent performance, sort of like enough performance for day-to-day tasks. But you got amazing battery life in a thin and light device. And look, there were Ultrabook style devices before the whole Ultrabook branding that Intel brought out.
I mean, I remember there were a couple of like big standouts that got 8-hour battery lives before 2010, but they were like, I think one of them was like $3,000. Like that's how much it cost for them to get it to work. I know Sony Vios, again, when Vio was actually owned by Sony, kind of pushed that, I feel like, before a lot of other people. But wasn't it like basically Ivy Bridge when Intel really started pushing this idea of, hey, these don't need to be that big anymore?
Yeah, it was around that sort of Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge time that I think they got efficient enough.
Which is like 2012, basically.
Yeah, and performant enough that you can get really good performance out of a 15-watt CPU. Before, you'd see the ULV, right? The really low voltage CPUs or low wattage CPUs, and people would sort of turn their nose up at that because it's like, oh no, those suck. Those are really bad in terms of performance. I don't want to touch those. And you only saw them in really specialized devices. But then there was this huge flip one year to the next where Intel went from making majority H-class style CPUs with a very small amount in the low power, and that just sort of flipped overnight, right? And that helped drive, I think, notebooks getting thinner and lighter, working in conjunction with OEMs. Along with the Ultrabook branding, I mean, Intel threw a lot of investment into cooling and pushing advancements in notebook cooling.
So they stopped melting.
Yeah, exactly right. Or at least they just handle the heat better. And Intel tends to work really closely with OEMs. They have tons of engineers, and they have a lot of their own patents and just oodles of money they throw into R&D in terms of development of reference platforms and reference designs that they can share with OEM partners, right? And fundamentally, there was a lot of that sort of special source cooling technology that went into the whole Ultrabook platform. It wasn't just a brand; it actually did mean a few things that it was more efficient because of X, Y, Z. Intel developed cooling solutions that were thin enough in terms of like the Z height, right? The actual height of components. Like they had to make fans that were thinner than normal, but could still push enough air.
They're
efficiently.
crazy thin now in some of these laptops. Like there's, it was an NV13T that I somewhat like almost assumed was fanless. But when I looked inside of it, I'm like, oh no, there really are still vents on this laptop that's half an inch thick at the max. And yet it actually has a fan and a vent. It's just literally entirely silent, and it really is that thin. Like that actually kind of blew my mind. I saw that on MacBooks too, although some of the newer MacBooks don't seem to have nailed cooling as well as I think they used to.
Yeah, well, that comes down to, Apple has a philosophical difference in terms of how they approach, how to balance cooling versus performance versus heat and noise, right? They greatly value having the quietest notebook as possible. So, they tend to not push their fans as hard. They let their notebooks get a little warmer maybe than other vendors. I think they all have their different approaches in that regard to how they might handle that. Other vendors might be known for being a bit, maybe noisier in terms of their fans, but they might have better cooling as a result.
So moving forward a little bit, I've got a reader mail I want to work in here before we completely forget about talking about batteries. Drita Full goes, was there an impact on laptop design after airlines banned the 100 watt hour batteries? That's actually, I think, an interesting question. When I look at laptops, even large ones that have giant batteries, they tend to be around 90. I don't remember there ever being batteries above 100 watt hours. I'm sure there were. Do you remember how big they used to get? Because I honestly don't.
Yeah, I don't remember any batteries that were above 100 watt hour like many, many years ago. It's not to say that there weren't products out there. Today, it's pretty rare that you'd find anything over 100 watt hours for that obvious reason. There are a couple of really specialized devices that I have seen that do have battery capacity over 100 watt hour, but they're not built in, right? They're removable batteries. So I think they sort of get around that restriction, because I think that restriction is specifically in regards to built-in batteries.
Okay.
But also, when you're dealing with a battery that's sort of above 80, 90 watt hours, they're heavy, right?
Yeah.
You're adding a lot of weight into whatever product it is that you're talking about. So, you're not going to fit these into a 13-inch thin and light laptop. Maybe you'll fit it into a thin and light 15 or even some 14-inch notebooks, I think, have some pretty big batteries in terms of capacity. But you're adding a lot of weight. And so it always comes back to, again, that balance around fundamentally what's more important. Is it battery life? Do we want to compromise on weight to put a bigger battery in here? Or do we want to hit a specific weight target, right?
Yes, and John DeLuca asked a similar question. I don't think I'll read the whole thing, but he's basically asking, will laptops finally come out with a larger battery that you can remove? Because that, he feels like maybe that's holding back battery capacity. But I guess let me ask the question this way. Were gigantic batteries kind of already on the way out before ones above 100 watt hours were banned?
Well, I mean, if you go back far enough, when batteries were removable, you could have like extended batteries. So you'd normally have like a 3 or a 4 cell built in, and then you could get like a 6 or a 9 cell extended, but it would literally poke out or poke underneath the laptop. They're kind of hilarious because they just weren't efficiently sort of packaged. I don't think we're going to see that again, because laptop designs have become way more integrated. So I don't think you're going to see that sort of modularity of swapping out components, because you can pack more battery capacity in there if you make it sort of non-removable, so to speak. I mean, you can always take the battery out by unscrewing the whole thing, but to make a battery removable, there's all that extra plastic around the battery itself, and then the chassis has to have like a cutout.
Yeah, you're kind of wasting a lot of space just to protect the battery that is then removed, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly right. So you're going to get more battery capacity by having it built in, and that's why everyone sort of moved in that way. Do we see a removable battery coming in? I don't know, man. Power banks have gotten way better, cheaper
that's
as well.
true as well. I have a power bank that's like, I think it is about 99 watt hour, and it can literally power, I think, up to 90 watts. Like when there was a power outage here, I recorded a podcast, actually. I believe it was episode 69, which, cue all the jokes, where I recorded it with this just giant flyable, like 90, I'm saying I can bring it on a plane, battery that is still strong enough to charge a pretty decent gaming laptop. Not a high-end one, but it's enough, right? In a world where those exist, I think that's a very good point that power banks kind of make the idea, almost not obsolete, but it's obsolescence. It's just not at the forefront of what people want anymore.
Yeah, they're a lot more flexible as well. I can charge my phone or my tablet with a power bank. I can charge the power bank separately. I can leave it at home or in the hotel room while I'm out.
You can use it for years. If your laptop breaks, you don't need to buy new extra batteries.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll work with, if it's a USB-C power bank, then in theory it should work with sort of any USB-C device.
So let's get into this a little more specifically. Generally speaking, what are the trade-offs you have to deal with most often in laptop design in your job? Like, what are most debates over when it comes to, is it weight versus battery capacity, or talk a bit about what most of the discussions are where you have to make cuts for a end product.
Yeah, well, I touched on it a bit earlier, and it really comes down to that sort of golden triangle of performance and cooling and weight, right? I mean, those are sort of the three areas, and it's always a case of trying to find the best balance. A good way of looking at it is if it's a thin and light laptop that's for commercial use, you don't need a graphics card. You care about having, long battery life. You care about having a clear screen, but you don't necessarily want like a big 4K high resolution display if you're just doing like spreadsheets or email, because that'll unnecessarily suck down battery life. So it's all about finding the right balance of components for the style of user, I guess, for the device. The two decisions that would go into a gaming notebook are vastly different, of course, than a thin and light laptop for like someone who's out in the field all the time, who just needs to do email and spreadsheets and that sort of thing.
One thing that I find interesting is as APUs became a bigger and a bigger thing from AMD and, you would say from Intel as well, I thought we'd see more and more the removal of the discrete graphics card. But I'm noticing in mid-range laptops more and more so, I guess, what do you call them now? They call them like performance Ultrabooks, or I think a term used a lot now is creator laptops, which aren't strictly gaming laptops, but they are basically designed and look like an Ultrabook. But they managed to shove a 2060 in there. And that's a trend I'm seeing more and more right now. I don't know if you'd comment on that at all, like how even laptops that probably weren't designed for gaming first are starting to get decent graphics cards.
So a word that I don't see used much anymore, maybe it's a very 90s thing or early thousands, is multimedia, right? So, I mean, that's what you'd used to call, I want a laptop for multimedia use, right? Which was kind of saying, I want to do all the day-to-day stuff, but I want a bit more grunt for video editing or some games or something like that. And yeah, I think there is that sort of mid-range where, it's like, I want a laptop configuration that has enough grunt to do video editing and maybe a bit of light gaming. I think people need to keep in mind, gaming absolutely flogs whatever hardware
Yeah.
you do
And
it
everything
on, right?
in the hardware, everything,
Yeah,
processor,
it's
graphics card.
one of the most stressful workloads outside of a artificial benchmark to run on PC hardware. Gaming, as you said, it touches everything. It touches the I/O, touches
Yeah,
the
that's
CPU,
right. And we're
the
seeing with the new
GPU.
consoles, it's even going to start probably really throttle, like thrashing IO and solid state drives that are going to suck even more power now.
Yeah, exactly right. So there is still a space for laptops where maybe they don't even have a 2060 class card. Maybe they have a 1660 Ti or something like that. Again, it's like good enough discrete graphics for maybe Adobe or something that might leverage it, or DaVinci. But it's going to have an i7 or an i9 in there because fundamentally the CPU is still maybe more important for that style of user. So yeah, the creator or creative classification that I have seen used, I'd say that's sort of the new multimedia classification. Yeah, I mean, you've got NVIDIA that have the Studio, RTX Studio. Yeah, so that to me is sort of like I work in, 3D modeling or whatever, but I still need some gaming features, right? And I mean, that can be another whole rabbit hole around sort of GeForce versus Quadro and different use cases there. But you get what you pay for as well, particularly on a laptop.
Well, I think one thing we're finding too with this new, or what you would say is reinventing multimedia class of laptops is as CPUs get more powerful and more efficient, we've got some extra space in here, frankly, right? Like people want typically a 13, 14, or 15-inch screen, and they want you to remove the bezels to save space. But once you do that, and once you make it thin, it's like, well, you're not really going to make it thinner than than like about half an inch, because at half an inch, I think I got a ruler right here. I mean, you're getting to the point where you could compromise, the structural integrity of the laptop if you make it any thinner, right? And so you have this extra space. Now the CPUs use 15 watts, and yet they have 8 cores and they run at 3 to 4 gigahertz. There's room for a 25 watt graphics card, right? That we didn't used to have room, but now we do. And I think it's pretty obvious that if you have 2 laptops, I mean, how much does the silicon really cost? I mean, I know do-it-yourself people pay like $100 to $300 for a mid-range graphics card. I'm telling you, in reality, these things, especially the smaller die ones, like a 1650, those graphics cards probably cost like less than $100 to make. And if you have 2 laptops for $1,200, but one's $1,300, and you can say GTX graphics included, I think that's just a gigantic selling point, and you have the room to fit it, right?
Definitely. No, I don't disagree with that. And I think we're sort of on the cusp of having really, really good integrated graphics. So, you've got Tiger Lake with the XE graphics, and from what we're seeing with early benchmarks, that seems like it should be pretty performant. It sort of does beg the question: why do you need an entry-level graphics card anymore in a sort of a low to mid-range laptop? If you don't have huge graphics demands, because it's quote unquote, or not quote unquote, but air quotes free, right? It comes with the CPU. And you see what AMD is doing on Renoir as well in terms of the inbuilt Vega graphics is no slouch either.
No.
It's not too bad, especially if you go up the stack and you get the more performance SKUs. That integrated graphics is sort of kind of good enough for 1080p gaming for most games.
Right now.
Yeah, right now. Yeah, let's see what happens.
Wait for the next gen to really get kicked off.
Exactly.
That's the only thing I'll say. I mean, look, the high-end Vega SKUs are stronger than the launch PS4, or at least comparable. However, it's about to be a last-gen console. Let me get into some reader mails that kind of relate to laptop design here. So H177 writes in and he says, now that we aren't traveling as much, everyone I've noticed is really starting to miss having 4 USB ports on their work laptops versus thinness and lightness. Can you please give us our USB ports back?
Well, I think the industry is slowly marching towards USB-C ubiquity, right? We're not there yet. We're still in that sort of messy, painful transition period. And let's just say that the USB consortium hasn't brought out the greatest branding around all of the permutations of USB. You kind of
yeah, it's kind
need
of random what they name them. Like, because what 3.1 is like twice as fast as 3. So why isn't it called USB 4? I found that a little odd.
It's horrific, right? So when you look at laptops and you want to try and make something as thin and light as possible, because it seems like fundamentally everyone wants devices to get thinner and lighter, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the industry we've got. That's the direction that the
all
industry's
things
gone.
considered, if you can just make it more portable, that's good, right? Yeah.
Yeah, battery life is good enough. Performance for day-to-day stuff, it's good enough. Gaming is something different, but if that's all you need, then thinner and lighter is welcomed. So when you get to a certain thickness of a laptop, you need to start making decisions around compromises, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a reason why we don't have VGA ports and Ethernet ports in laptops anymore, right? So not only do some of those standards, they're kind of dead, but also you physically can't fit them in anymore. And when you look at a lot of laptops that are super thin, there's only enough room for a USB-C port or a Thunderbolt port,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, some vendors have done clever stuff. So HP on their Spectre laptops have like a little drop-down hinge for their USB-A ports on a couple of the Spectres.
Cool.
That's really cool. I don't know how durable that hinge would be over, many, many years. But that's a cool design.
I'll let you know
right?
if one breaks. So far, no problems after a few years.
Okay. Fingers crossed, right?
And I'm tough on my stuff.
So when you start getting to a certain thickness, you need to make decisions around what do you want to keep in and what do you want to remove. Now, all those comments are more in regards to consumer devices. When you look at commercial products, whether it's from Dell or HP or Lenovo, they all have USB-A ports still, as well as Type-C and HDMI, and some of them still have Ethernet. And quite often, they'll have Type-C for power. So it's like they've found, I think, a good middle ground for commercial users, because they absolutely still want USB-A. It's fundamental to.
I think you have to include a couple of USB-As. Just you have to. I mean, because it sucks so much when you just can't plug in something.
Yeah, when I've got maybe a colleague that has a notebook that only has Type-C ports, I always say, welcome to dongle life. I say while I hand him, one of several various dongles that he needs to plug like a USB key in or a display in or whatever, right? So, like I said, we're still in that sort of messy in-between transition phase, but we're getting there, right? More and more peripherals are coming out with USB-C ports, more hard drives, more mice, even headphones and phones themselves are using USB-C, particularly to charge. So it's funny, we haven't seen, this whole revolution with all peripherals with USB-C. So there's, try and find a USB-C speaker that isn't like a crappy travel speaker.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That hasn't happened yet. So I think there's certain categories that they still need to get USB-C ports built in, and you're going to have other areas like AV, right? Home theater setups. They're going to continue using HDMI, right? They're not going to move to USB-C, maybe for peripherals to connect in, but that's fundamentally not going to change. So, it is, I think there's a good question around like, how long is it until we are fully in a USB-C world? I don't know. I think the transition is going to be 10 years. We're maybe halfway there. So, I agree. USB-A still has a place. And if you find the right laptop, you'll still have USB-A ports. But definitely some vendors have been very aggressive in removing USB-A. I think Dell's XPS is a good example where they dropped USB-A, I think, a year or two ago.
Yeah.
They're pretty much.
But you're saying, can we get these back? And you're saying, look, despite people maybe using their laptops at home more often now, they're not coming back. The trend is going to continue, right?
Yeah, well, I think once they're gone, they're gone. So sorry. The answer would be, unfortunately, a dongle. right?
Yeah, which
Or
is annoying. But I guess I'll say this. Once you have a decent dongle, especially with like the latest USB, like 3.1s or 3.1 Gen 2s, or I think that is actually what it's called. What a ridiculous name. Thunderbolts. One USB-C dongle can power like 4 USB-As, an Ethernet port, and an HDMI. So, I think you just buy that once and use it on all your laptops, right?
definitely. But I mean, that kind of brings us full circle to the docking question, because those docks that you plug in the one cable and that gives you power, video, audio, data all over one connection, and that connects to all your peripherals. So then it's like, maybe I don't want lots of ports on my laptop. I want the thinnest and lightest thing possible. But when I need to have that desktop-like experience or plug into all my peripherals, I have a dock that everything's already plugged into that has all the legacy ports and connections on it. I mean, you can almost call USB-A a legacy style port in some ways, right? When you're looking forward.
Yeah, so I suppose so. Yeah. I mean, moving on to another question here. Seamus writes in and says, "Hi, Tom and guest. Do you have any suggestions as to why laptop screens seemingly skipped 1440p on their way to 4K, despite how common 1440p monitors are? I feel 1440p is pretty much made for laptop-sized screens, so I find it just odd that I don't see a lot of manufacturers using them. We always seem to have to choose between 1080p and 4K.
Yeah, I think that the answer here, and I don't think there's any special insight, I think a lot of people can sort of work this out themselves. Marketing. I mean, having that 4K sticker slapped on the box, it can be powerful for a lot of consumers out there. And the industry, 4K is a selling point. 1080p or 1440p is not a selling point. Look at the confusion over 1440p with the Xbox Series S unveil, right? A lot of people don't understand that. It's still a pretty good resolution, but because it's not 4K, it's crap. It's not what I want. So I kind of agree. 1440p is probably the sweet spot for 14, 15-inch screen sizes. If you want sort of like a 1-to-1 pixel scaling or 100% desktop scaling, yeah, 1440p would be great. There might be 1440p displays coming in the pipeline. I think we also need to remember that OEMs are limited by the component manufacturers. There might not actually be anyone that makes 1440p screens in volume in the sizes you want. So I've seen some 1440p displays in gaming notebooks, particularly high refresh rate gaming notebooks like 15 inches. But when you look at the few 17-inch notebooks that are on the market, they're pretty much 1080p or 4K, because nobody makes a 1440p 17-inch panel, right? You might be able to find 1 or 2 examples out there, but then you start getting into the discussions around supply chain and what's the capacity of that supplier and how long are they going to be making those panels, and is there a second source that I can get those panels from in case that supplier has an issue, right? These are all sort of supply chain questions that feed into decisions around what panel do we use. They might be more expensive as well, right? So costs, over time come down on components. And
that's what I keep trying to explain to people too, because I get into arguments. I believe you listen to my podcasts from time to time, and so you probably heard me do this, like trying to explain to people that you have to understand there's 1080p, and that was the gold standard for like a decade, frankly, right? In many ways, it still is. And then there's 4K. It seems to me that indeed 1440p has become a fairly common standard in PC gaming on desktop. But that's basically it, right? The next standard is 4K, and that's that. And so if you have a bunch of manufacturers all targeting the next standard that they know will be the next standard for the next 20 years, it's probably the same price to put a 4K display as it is a 1440p in a laptop, guys. Like when I look at gaming monitors even, and this is something I also keep trying to explain, it's like when I look at the cost of a 4K display and a 1440p, usually it's arbitrary that the 4K is more. It probably doesn't cost much more to make, honestly. Like, it really doesn't. Like, I don't know if you can touch on that at all. Like, I mean, everyone makes 4K or 1080p. So, that's kind of the answer, isn't it?
And you got to look at where investment dollars would be poured, to what you're saying around what people are targeting as maybe the next standard in the future. If I'm a manufacturer or a component supplier, it's, well, where's the future demand going to be, right? What are people going to buy? It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, but still, it's, I'd be putting money into 4K R&D development, make 4K panels thinner, make them brighter, make them use less power. I might not necessarily put that same investment into a 1440p or a 1080.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think the argument you would make is, all right, so this is a 15-inch screen. You're like, 4K, I don't need that high of a resolution. Then do you need more than 1080p? Like, to use your own argument against you, right?
Yeah, well, that's where, when you look at the commercial products, most commercial notebooks are 1080p.
Yeah.
You can build to order a 4K or a 1440p screen option, but they're pretty much all 1080p because that's good enough for, office style tasks. Like I said, 4K is a great marketing sort of almost like a brand for consumers, for them to spend more money into buying a more expensive configuration. Whereas businesses look at that extra cost and go, no, thank you. Our cost per head budget is maybe $1,000, and we don't want to spend that extra $200 on a 4K screen because we don't see the business benefit in doing so.
And if you're going to save money, right, you're just going to save money. You're not going to say, oh, but maybe we get the one in the middle. It's like either we want to give them a huge resolution bump, or we're going to give, I mean, like, what's enough? And 1080p is enough. Gosh, Reese, why does Windows 10 Professional have to be so expensive? Don't listen to that, nerd. Listen to me. You can get all the great Windows and gaming keys you need at CDK Offers. I have a plan. Go to cdkoffers.com to get all the Windows Professional and Microsoft Office keys you need, and games as well. Add them to your cart, and you can even apply one of them City Slicker promotional codes like DieShrink for 3% off software and Broken Silicon for 25% off all Windows codes. I do have an account on this website, and it is ultra easy to use. Just submit your order, use PayPal, credit card, or Bitcoin, and go to Windows website to download Microsoft Professional. One more time, that's go to cdkoffers.com. They are a fantastic sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead. Use offer code DieShrink for 3% off everything on the website, and Broken Silicon for 25% off all Windows products. Now, back to the show. So let me see here. So DJ5K writes in and he says, it seemed like basically all laptop OEMs were sleeping on Renoir until it launched and subsequently went viral due to its high reviews. Why was that? And what has happened afterwards? Is our OEMs jumping on the bandwagon now? Or like basically he's just asking, why did it seem like, no one was ready for the high demand of Renoir? I don't know if you can speak to that at all.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of people are asking the same thing. I'd say AMD probably doesn't have as many strong established relationships with as many vendors as maybe Intel does. I mean, that would be a starting point. I can't speak to why certain companies made the decision to take it up or not, for that matter. But I think that's a good observation, and I think based on what we're seeing, considering the performance you get out of it, you might see more designs from more manufacturers next year leveraging AMD CPUs. I think that, a good question would be, what's AMD charging the vendors? Are they more expensive or less expensive than Intel, right? What kind of extra support might Intel give? We spoke about Ultrabooks, and Intel put tons of R&D into cooling solutions for the whole new category of Ultrabooks. Intel was literally trying to push the entire industry uphill in terms of pushing and advancing designs. AMD might not have that same level of support or investment. So, I think there's a lot of questions beyond just why didn't they choose that chip? Because a lot of the products that you see that come to market, they're in development for years, right? It takes years to bring something to market. Yes, you can bring something to market within a year. You can rush it. I think one of the most famous examples was the original iPod. I think that was conceptualized and brought to market within the same year, but that was fundamentally a far more simple device, right?
Yeah.
Computers are horrifically complex products, and I think people don't always appreciate, that it's not an appliance. It's a very high-end electrical, highly engineered device that has all sorts of things that need to happen for it to be brought to market. Not only is all the development that happens on the hardware and software side in terms of drivers and everything else, you got regulatory stuff, headaches you got to deal with, right? You got to get lots of rubber stamps paid for and done, and that takes time. So you can't rush a lot of this stuff, and this is why I think you might see more AMD products in the future. I would honestly, I'd be surprised if you didn't see more AMD SKUs from more manufacturers, considering the performance that you're getting with Renoir and I think Tiger Lake H is sort of, we're yet to see what we'll get with that. But yeah, a lot of these decisions are made years in advance. So quite often the OEMs don't know what the actual performance of the hardware is going to be. They kind of have to aim for like a particular target, and you need to sort of work to that and whittle down when you get closer and closer. Okay, it's using less power than we thought, so we can have better cooling, or maybe we can, bring that down a bit and save some money on the cooling, and et cetera, right? Like, there's a lot of considerations that need to be made very early on.
Well, and I think, this is, a talking point I have there. Why is it so bloody hard to get an AMD laptop? I mean, I think there is some room for people to complain when they look at the efficiency advantage Renoir truly has over Intel's offerings right now. Like, Tiger Lake's made up for some of it in some use cases, but still overall, Renoir, just speaking personally, I think makes Intel look like an absolute joke, right, in the laptop space. And yet almost, a lot of, like, if you go to Razer's website, they only have Intel CPUs still. There's a lot of OEMs that I would argue effectively are only selling Intel. I know they may have a couple token AMD offerings, right? But like, I think before we get into that, I do want to point out to people, it is way better than it was a few years ago. Like 4 years ago, even though I thought AMD's, even though they were, part of the bulldozer, lineage of CPUs, some of their APUs overall were really impressive for the overall performance you got. And I remember there were some you just could not get. Like, I remember the top Excavator APU. I could not find a single laptop that was worth anything that was at all good that had it. Like, literally any. And then when Zen 1 and Zen Plus came out, no, you can find them. There were AMD laptops. They were just rare. And I think with Renoir, it's like, no, there's options. There are options now. It's not just how good the processor is and then they throw it into a chassis. What I want to talk to you kind of specifically is like, how much of the design of the laptop isn't just the time, but the amount of support Intel gives OEMs, right?
Yeah, well, they do give some support. So again, like I said, when you look at things like the whole Ultrabook initiative, Intel was pretty public in saying that they've developed all kinds of new cooling solutions to help OEMs, reach these thickness targets, because you had to be under a certain thickness to be classed as an Ultrabook. And, they always have this kind of initiative. Ultrabook stuck around for a long time. And then we had, Project Athena, right? Which was sort of the same thing in a way, but it wasn't. it
A new
wasn't
one.
marketed sort of publicly, but it was like Intel's rubber stamping of, you know, if we give Athena certification, it means it's thin, it's light, it's good performance, and it gets long battery life. And potentially they may have had a hand in the development of those products, maybe not. But I think we've got the same thing happening just around the corner as the whole Evo platform, which is just Athena 2.0, right? But I think a bit more obvious in terms of branding. So it seems that Intel has a bit more resources and support for their partners, maybe more than AMD, right? So, if you're a big company, you're developing products, and are you going to choose the vendor that might have chips that are 10% faster on paper and benchmarks, but doesn't have the engineering support or R&D, or maybe doesn't have the same level of supply? Or are you going to go with Old Faithful, right? That you've got established good relationships with, regular supply cadence.
People whose names and numbers you have, that you've been working with at Intel to design laptops for years. You can call them and say, hey, how would we handle this, right? Because I think you said this to me before, and I think I've heard another OEM talk to me about how Intel will literally go from the ground up and say, hey, here's a cooling solution we helped engineer for this type of processor we have coming out, and we'll help you design it into your laptop, HP or Dell or Lenovo, right? Whereas sometimes AMD shows up and they'll help, but they don't have the whole thing thought out. It's like, hey, can you put this into this laptop you already have? And that takes a lot more money to just put that in. And then you don't have, I mean, let's be honest, for now, still, the Intel name carries weight, right? I mean.
Oh, absolutely. And you've seen the same thing with NVIDIA with I think it was the Studio RTX laptops. That was kind of also a platform where they were going to help OEMs with more advanced cooling solutions for the high-end discrete graphics in a thin and light notebook. And that was sort of, to me, it was just Ultrabook 2.0, but for graphics, right? In terms of the same approach. So, yeah, I see online a lot of people say, Asus cripples, the AMD SKU of this laptop versus the Intel because the cooling is the same or it's worse or whatever. It's like, well, they don't go out to sabotage their own product.
They didn't try to.
Yeah, let's not be absurd here. They last thing they want is customers complaining and logging tech support calls that their laptop isn't working as well as it should be, right? So they're going to make a product that's capable, but to what extent, they're going to have resources to put into the design? I don't know. That's a good question. If we see more and more amazing AMD products come out, then you'll have more and more vendors interested in utilizing AMD platforms, because ultimately it's what the consumer wants. And if the consumers are going to turn around and say, we want AMD products, and I'm not talking about the vocal minority, right, that always want the latest and greatest. I'm talking about big businesses that will turn around.
I think you're starting to see that now too.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think, more acceptance in let's just say, compared to a few years ago, where AMD was always seen as like the cheap entry-level option, and that was it. It was Intel or bust, right? Now I think a lot more organizations are, at least, they may be open to consideration around, they might say, well, the old adage, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. I think the same thing applies today with PCs, right? Nobody ever got fired for procuring Intel. It's the tried and true product. So why change? Why introduce risk in terms of a fundamental change in vendor or product?
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it is, I think especially in the mid-range gaming laptop space, you're just going to see AMD take a ton of market share, because the most vocal people for the best performance and best performance for the price are gamers, especially mid-range gamers, right? But I think what you're going to see is a kind of mix of both over the next year and the ultra high end, simply because Intel's brand name with a lot of gamers still carries weight, even if maybe I would argue sometimes those gamers have no clue what they're talking about when they recommend Intel, the high end. And I think in the low end, the fact is Intel has this advantage in scale where they own their own foundries, and I've seen the numbers. Like sometimes OEMs are getting i7s for like $50 each, right? Like they're a lot cheaper than they are on Newegg, by the way, guys. And so, it says i7, there's an Intel sticker, and you're right, it opens Word. And I don't think anyone's complaining with whichever processor it has. But I do want to kind of move on to a sort of a final leg of this conversation here. I'm going to start it off with this reader mail question. Luca writes in and says, why do so many vendors use crappy thermal paste when they spend so much money on all of these other components, including the cooling system in a laptop? I mean, MX4 thermal paste can remove 10 degrees Celsius at times compared to the cheaper stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I can't directly answer that because I'm not a thermal engineer, and I don't have full insight into how those decisions get made. But I think that 5 to 10 degrees, that's probably a very niche situation. Maybe there was really crappy applied thermal paste in the very beginning. And look, there's tons of guides online that say, if you remove the standard thermal paste and use this, aftermarket stuff, you can get 2 or 3 or even maybe 5 degrees better. Sure, right? Absolutely. But, I think you got to think about how much that stick of thermal paste costs you. $5, $10.
I think his argument would be, though, isn't this, a $2,000 laptop, though?
Yeah, sure. But at the end of the day, decisions around costs are made on every component, right? So, I can't speak to that exact example, but I think, I'm not saying vendors cheap out, but quite often it can come down to the quality control on the production line at the ODM, right? In terms of how is the thermal paste applied. Maybe they're doing a crappy job of it. We've definitely seen that with some products. I think there were some Xbox 360s that had really bad applied thermal paste, and it led to all sorts of issues. So
I believe they use like a thermal pad or something. Like if I remember correctly, like one of the fixes for the 360 that would sometimes work was they would say, take it apart, remove this thermal pad, and then add thermal paste and put pennies on it here. I do remember watching that video. Yeah. Keep in mind, this was like 15 years ago that I watched this video. So my memory is a little fuzzy.
One aspect on this is the recent PS5 teardown, where they've utilized liquid metal.
Yeah.
And
that's
an
certainly
decision,
not high margins on there, So if they could save a few dollars, they would. Right.
Yeah, but they were kind of very open and saying that they spent years engineering a solution that would work with liquid metal, because there's all sorts of problems around liquid metal where it's awesome, but it has issues over time, and it looks like they've been able to mitigate that with that little lip around the area they've applied and a few other sort of engineering tricks. And all I'm just saying is I'm quietly crossing my fingers behind my back. I trust Sony have very clever engineers working for them, but let's see how that holds up in very, very long-term situations. But, this stuff is really tricky. So there's a reason why you don't see liquid metal used in mass-produced electronics. And hopefully this achievement that Sony's done with the PS5 might change that, fundamentally for the industry, because, quite often a vendor will come up with a clever design and a few years later you'll start to see that proliferate through to other products and other vendors.
Well, I'm sure they put thought into it. They want to sell over 100 million of these, so I don't think, they would have done it willy-nilly if they thought it was going to break. I think
exactly,
and I think just the standards have changed too for some of these high-volume devices. People expect their stuff to work now. Like if you think about especially older consoles, and we put up with some really shitty reliability, didn't we? Compared to now. Like, my God, everything used to break, in my opinion. Like, it's just ridiculous. An example I want to give, though, about the thermal paste that I think a lot of people might miss is, so when you put this great, and I have MX4 thermal paste, right? When you put this thermal paste on your personal device, you unscrew the laptop very carefully. You probably heat it up first, right? And then you unscrew it delicately, take off this heat sink. Use alcohol, be very careful. Here's the bare die. And then you'd very, carefully and delicately put on this perfect dot of MX4 and then close it up and seal it just perfectly. Yet, Dell or HP is producing millions of laptops, right, on an assembly line. There's not typically someone there hand assembling this super delicately. So what you have to ask yourself is, well, maybe this thermal paste is better. How well does a giant vat of it, not a little syringe in your hand, a giant vat of it keep over hours on an assembly line? How easy is it to transport? Does MX4 last very long before you apply it once you've opened it? Can this take being on an assembly line and sitting in a vat for hours making millions of laptops? And then also the machinery to make like a newer XPS or something, they're using a lot of the same machinery they've been using for 5 years. So liquid metal would be better, but is that on the assembly line? How much does it cost to upgrade that component on the assembly line? I think you touched on it, right? Sony's doing this now. They're putting in the effort. I wouldn't be surprised when you look at these vapor chambers going into laptops and stuff, if they're starting to do this and plan for this as well. It just takes years to implement it in an assembly line situation. And it's very different from when you're delicately taking apart your favorite laptop at home over an hour, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not Dell or HP. It's also the ODMs, Foxconn, Compal, Winstron, right? Like, you got to work with these guys to get that stuff rolled out, and they are their own businesses. They might not necessarily have the capability, or they might be able to do it, but not in the way you want, or whatever, right? So, yeah, there's a lot of challenges that goes into why not just use better thermal paste, right? I mean, it's like, yep, that's a whole box of worms to open up there.
Well, and let's continue this then. What else do you see changing? We talked about in depth how crappy laptops used to be, how over time there was this focus on, U series CPUs over H, better battery life, because the batteries can fit into more nooks and crannies, and because the components are more efficient, higher resolution screens, SSDs. Like, I think for the past few years, laptops, you're pretty good if you get a used laptop from 3 years ago. It works pretty well now. And that certainly, man, if you got a 2009 laptop instead of a 2012, it was a lot worse. Like, where do you see laptops changing over the next, 3 to 5 years?
I don't think they will change that much, frankly, right? So when you look at industries, and they sort of go through periods of rapid innovation, and then they plateau off for sometimes a long time, sometimes it might be a short time before the next sort of big innovation. We haven't really seen a lot of changes fundamentally for probably the last 5 years or so. I'm not sure that we really will for the next 5 years, other than everything getting thinner, lighter, more efficient, more powerful. The laptop itself isn't going to go away, right?
I agree. I think that's a design we like,
Right? Yeah. Tablets came and went. We thought tablets were going to demolish laptops, and tablet was going to be the new mobile sort of device form factor. Didn't happen, right?
And I'll speak, I like laptops. I like the compact kind of Ultrabook netbook design where, hey, guess what? If you close it and you drop it, it's protected. The screen isn't exposed. When you open it, you can put a touchscreen on a laptop. And frankly, I think it's almost as easy to just carry around an ultralight laptop that's opened up as it is a tablet. Just use the touchscreen, and then you have a keyboard sitting there. I agree. I think laptops will remain the standard, and they will just maybe fold and have a touchscreen, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen, laptops do interesting things like have 360 hinges, or the likes of Microsoft have made sort of detachable style products, I guess better, more refined. But when you look at really what sells in volume, it's the humble laptop. and that ain't going away anytime soon. Even 360 style designs, I don't think that's going to take over and become the standard form factor, right? Because
I think you find, right, even if you can fold it open and use a touchscreen, like if it weighs 5 pounds, I don't want to hold that in one hand.
Right? Yeah, and that adding that glass in adds weight, adds cost. How many okay, so the 360 style form factor. How many people do you see in the wild, depending where you are, obviously pre-COVID, right, in the wild, actually folding it over and using it? Or bonus points for folding it over and using it with a stylus, right? How many people do you actually see using that?
Those look so nice in advertisements, though.
It looks great. It's. I'm always reminded of the Steve Jobs quote around we don't sell the sausage, we sell the sizzle, or there's a general sort of marketing philosophy around.
Don't sell the steak, sell the sizzle.
Yeah, selling the idea, right? And the idea of using a pen to take notes and OneNote and do all these fancy things. It sounds great, but I don't think many people really do it. I've tried really hard several times to use a 360 style device with a stylus, and it just doesn't work for me, right? Some people it does, sure, but I think they're significantly in the minority. So, Microsoft have done such a great job around pen and handwriting recognition. It's almost freakish, how terrible my handwriting is and how well it'll pick it up. But I don't want to say it's all for waste. It isn't. It's pretty cool technology, but I just don't see that shift happening, right? I think the humble laptop with the touchpad and the keyboard is going to stick around. Screens will get better. Webcams will get better. They'll get thinner.
I was going to touch
lighter
on that, right? Luis Correa writes in and says, when are we going to get decent webcams finally? And it's really insane. I look at laptops for the channel for mobile editing. Yeah, it'd be nice if it had like at least a 1080p even, or 1440p 4K camera, so I could record a video without having to get out a nicer one. But the fact is, they're all 720p still. The highest I've seen is 1080p. I'm sure you don't need to comment. I'm sure there's someone who put a 4K camera in there, but I can't find them in any of the mainstay devices. So I do think that's some low hanging fruit that really needs to be improved on soon.
It's challenging, right? It's actually almost more challenging than a smartphone, because when you see how thin some of the LCD panels are, or the lids for the laptop, right? That's like half the thickness of a mobile phone. And you got to think there's also the LCD panels in there. You've got maybe a sheet of Gorilla Glass as well. You need room to route all the ribbon cables and all that. So it's like, okay, we've only got this many millimeters of space that we have to deal with, and it's really tough to put a decent webcam in that. So I think there's a couple of vendors out there. HP has just announced their new EliteBooks. When I say just announced, it was like a couple of months ago, I think. I think they have 1080p webcams now. Microsoft Surface products have had 1080p webcams for quite a while. I think they've been a leader in that. But again, a Surface Pro is a tablet. It's rather thicker, right? So it's easy to put a better webcam in that. But I think pretty much everyone else is stuck to 720p because you can only fit a certain style of sensor. And there's been advancements in shrinking the current sensors down, but I think it's really challenging to put a 1080p or a 4K camera into that small a spot. And I agree, it's low-hanging fruit.
Well, but because of working from home, though, people are realizing they finally want those good cameras, right?
Well, it's shifting in priorities, right? Suddenly the webcam is really important now, when it was just a nice to have for many, many years. So, the question is for future notebook development, do we invest in better webcams? Do we continue to just, the current webcams are sort of good enough maybe for what people need versus maybe what they want? These are considerations that will feed into, I think, decisions around notebook designs in the coming years. But, the vendors can't change on a dime. When you look at the shift that we've had with COVID and the changing in usage and buying behavior, vendors can't just ship out a better webcam in 6 months. It doesn't work that way. We might.
But you do think they're coming though because of this?
I think it's inevitable. Just like it's inevitable that you're going to see a lot of other advancements in terms of battery capacity or weight or performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, webcams are going to improve. We know there's better webcams out there. It's just a case of making them small enough, right? It's always, everything's doable in terms of engineering challenges. It's just how much money are you willing to pay?
Yeah. And so it sounds like you're saying you expect a little bit better here and there on everything, but no fundamental shifts really in the next 5 years, right?
Yeah, I can't see, any massive changes. I mean, the whole point with big innovations is that it's also kind of a bit unforeseen or unexpected.
Yeah, that's true.
People didn't really expect the first iPad to be such a good product in terms of
everyone made fun of it.
What it went out. There were lots of jokes about the name iPad. What is it? A hygiene product. But everybody quickly forgot about that when they started using the device and realizing just like how good it was. And you fast forward to today, Apple owns the tablet market because Android tablets kind of suck. Some of the hardware is good, but the software is
You just angered
garbage.
a bunch of people listening, I'm sure.
I'm sure I did, right? But at the end of the day, numbers don't lie. Why are majority of tablets sold out their iPads, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's because people prefer the end user experience around that device. Regardless of what software it is or whatever, it's a better user experience fundamentally, right? Now, that's different with mobile phones. Android's come a long way. I think it's up to you whether you want iOS or Android.
Mm-hmm.
There's pluses and minuses on both of them. But yeah, when you look at these areas where there's been big innovation, it's really interesting to see. So what's the next big thing? I have no clue. I can't wait for someone to bring out, you've watched Westworld, right?
Yeah.
And so, that kind of foldable device that it's a phone and then it's sort of, you can fold it out.
See, but now I'm starting to question that, right? It's funny you bring that up because I remember, again, right, I've said this diatribe a million times. If you were to ask me 5 years ago, let's say it's 2015, I'd be like, oh yeah, by the early 2020s, we'll have self-driving cars and foldable phones and blah, blah, blah. Now it's already 2020 and it's like, well, those foldable phones break. And you're starting to realize that it's always going to be cheaper and more robust to just have one screen. And then you also look at self-driving cars, and it's like they're out there, but I don't think you're going to get 3 billion people to upgrade in 10 years their cars.
Well, a lot of this stuff sometimes it's harder than what we maybe expected. Or when it comes to foldable devices today, I think we're limited in the materials that are literally out there, right?
Yeah.
It's like one day we'll have a device that the material that it's made out of can be folded, but it doesn't leave any gaps and it's super strong and it can kind of click into place when it's fully folded out, or it can snap into place when it's fully folded into like a phone form factor. So I love sci-fi shows and seeing what they kind of try and think up. Because I think...
And I agree, for the record. Like, I think if I could have a phone that folds open into four... Like, I can unfold it almost like a map, like 4 ways, and then it turns into a tablet. And then if I could just have like, I don't know, how about a scanner keyboard get projected out and I can use it as a gaming laptop? That sounds ideal. But at the same time, 20 years from now, if they just offer a solid screen and it doesn't break or has a battery life that's 5 times longer, I think this is when I start asking fundamental questions. Not to be a party pooper, but won't they always have probably better battery lives and half the cost if they don't fold? And isn't this almost what we're seeing with laptops, like you said, right?
For now, sure. Yeah, for now.
Like the humble laptop. If everyone could have a touchscreen on their laptop for free, they would. And I actually like touchscreens on a laptop. I'm one of those people. But if it's even $100, $50, most of my friends say I won't even pay $50 to add a touchscreen to a laptop. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So it depends on what people actually see value in. If they see value in it, sure. If it's marketed in a slick way and there's actual real world usage for particular things, then sure. I mean, unfortunately, the native app ecosystem on Windows is been pretty garbage when it comes to touch support and pen support.
Yeah.
So this is why I think we haven't seen huge adoption of tablet-style Windows devices. I would love a tablet device that just does everything like a Surface Pro.
Yeah.
But,
and it's your phone, maybe, if you fold it up.
Maybe, right? But at the end of the day, like the software ecosystem just isn't there on Windows to have that sort of iPad-style experience. So, I think we'll get there one day. There needs to be a lot more advancements in wireless connectivity as well. So when you think about how Wi-Fi and Bluetooth today works, it is shit. It is so clunky. This device doesn't quite connect properly. Sometimes this other thing does. Just do a firmware update. That'll fix all the problems. It's like, I shouldn't have to do a firmware update in the first place, right? Like, there's all these niggling little things that need to be addressed before we get there. I mean, there's some things that Apple have done with, their AirPods, right? Mm-hmm. When you just open up the AirPods case next to a phone, it just automatically pairs. They just handshake and go, hello. Yeah. That's how all wireless devices should be, right?
And I think they will be eventually, because, more and more people will figure it out, and more people will say, I'm not buying this if it isn't easy to use. I really think in 20 years, people will look back at this time period kind of like how we look back at like the late 1800s. Like, can you believe the crap people had to put up with to do anything? Like the amount of, like back then it was harder than now, but they'll look at us and go, look at all these chargers they had. And it's like, you guys really had to get different. Like, first of all, they won't even need to plug anything. I think everything will be wirelessly charged, even without being on a desk. Like, I think literally you'll, like, almost like Wi-Fi will be beamed in. Like, we're getting into futurism here, but...
Yeah, well, I mean, you don't have to look to the future. I mean, it's hilarious.
It still exists to a certain degree.
Well, here's the thing, right? A lot of these technologies that we want to see in cutting-edge devices, they've been around for a long time. It's just a case of making it better, making it more affordable, making it more applicable. Wireless charging, wireless docking, there were laptops 10 years ago that had that functionality, right? Mm-hmm. But it was expensive to implement, didn't work too well. There are all sorts of challenges. There are regulatory problems around using certain wireless bands.
You want to make sure you're not giving people cancer or more likely messing with the frequency between different bands, right?
Well, yeah, certain bands you're not allowed to use in certain countries. So, fast forward 10 years, we've got Wi-Fi 6E on the horizon that should give us access to, I think it's a 60 gigahertz band that, will enable really high speed, low latency, sort of within the same room, device-to-device connectivity. Mm-hmm. We'll see how on the software side and firmware side that's handled. But, I just keep saying we need more of that innovation to happen, to have more of these seamless user experiences where, frankly, the device just gets out of the way. I can just focus on doing what I want to do, right? Some of my favorite examples, again, going to sci-fi situations, is like Westworld. There's scenes where characters sit down in front of a workstation and they put their tablet down, and it just wirelessly connects to the screen like and everything lights up. Yeah, we'll get there one day. How long that'll be, I have no idea. I'm not a betting man, so, I'll keep my money in my pocket.
Exactly. That's what I was kind of saying, right? Like 5 years ago, I would have been like, oh, yeah, all this stuff will happen. And now I'm like, well, it will, but probably not as quickly as I thought.
Yeah, exactly. So, look, fingers crossed we get to that future quickly.
Let me see here. So, Eshel Dar Epshin writes in, hope I said that right, and says, what type of gaming laptop would you buy? You going to get one of those 17-inch 5K laptops with 2 power supplies, or would you get a more lighter laptop and maybe an eGPU?
I'm a desktop guy. I mean, I fiddled around with gaming notebooks, and I even fiddled with an eGPU for a while just to see what it was like. And none of those experiences were fantastic. To be perfectly frank, it wasn't really what I was used to. I like having a big, stonking, powerful desktop underneath the desk that sits there, hums away, and I have a nice big screen to do what I want to do, right? So in terms of what I like having a thin and light notebook that has sort of enough power, but I like a thin and light notebook that has a big screen. Like give me a 15-inch that has an ultra low power CPU, like a 15-watt CPU, and a big ass battery. I don't even need a good graphics card, right? Just give me that. And the LG Gram kind of fits in that category.
Yes,
and
that's exactly like what you sounds like you want.
I like that. Yeah, I like that product, and I haven't got around to getting one myself yet, but it seems to be a very popular product in that category because I think LG found a niche that not many vendors were making.
I mean, it's almost the size of a 13-inch laptop, but it has a 15.6-inch screen, which is crazy impressive, honestly. And again, it's weight, right? Like it also doesn't weigh a lot. And I think people, again, kind of like your Westworld tablet thing, it's like, you can make it fold up as much as you want or as small as you want. If that thing weighs more than 2 pounds, I'm not carrying it around.
Exactly. So, what we're seeing today with foldable devices in particular, this is sort of like version 1.0. The laptops that we have today is version 20.0, right?
Yeah.
So we haven't had the iteration yet when it comes to even mobile devices. We're on like generation, 6 or 7, right? We're not even there at the same level yet. So I always say with these things, give it time. To the early adopters that want to pay, $1,500 for a Samsung foldable phone, go for it. I wouldn't. If it was my money, I'd stay well away. But if you want to, help pay for more innovation down the line for the rest of us, go right ahead. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would just say kind of on that whole subject that I don't personally see I've always loved the idea of eGPUs, like external GPUs for a laptop. I could see that being a solution I'd go with eventually, but they're just not there. There's the bandwidth limitations. I always see this. It's hilarious, right? It's like, oh, unfortunately, if you have more than something around a 2060, I think straight up 2080s perform 20% worse. Like you might as well get a 5700 XT if you're going to have an external GPU. But at that point, though, they make GPUs that strong in laptops that are pretty thin now. So it's like, and then you look at the cost of the enclosure, and it's like, look, if it was like $150 for the enclosure, which some of them might be getting close to there now, and I could put
some are there, yeah,
and then I could put I don't know, whatever it is. I guess now an RTX 3080 or whatever big Navi is in there, and that whole thing didn't lose performance compared to if it was in a desktop, then it makes sense. But if you tell me this external GPU costs $400 or the enclosure does, and then you tell me I'm going to lose 20% performance, I might as well just get a thin laptop with a 2070 built into it. Like it'll cost the same. And now it's always in the laptop.
And I think that's the problem is that maybe 3 years ago, eGPUs seemed like a great idea because we weren't quite there in terms of the graphics performance in a laptop style form factor. But because touring products just got so good,
Well, really with Pascal too, right?
Oh, well, no, totally. Sorry. With Pascal, they just got so good on the mobile side. And I guess touring was more of an iteration of that. Then, that kind of, I think, killed a lot of that eGPU market because you've touched on the problems there, which is there's always a performance overhead. So you're always sacrificing performance. And the cost of that kind of setup is always going to be more expensive. So it's like more expensive than a desktop anyway. So it's like, well,
or close enough where it's like just build a desktop and get a thin and light laptop, or just you have the money, get. Like I already mentioned it, I saw a Razer laptop that has a 2080 Super in it. And after everything's said and done, you're spending like an extra $500 to just have it built into your laptop. So just do that.
Yeah, so graphics cards just almost got too good in a lot of ways. And eGPUs never really came down that much in price. You can get cheap ones, but then you're compromising on, it can't charge the laptop or it doesn't have lots of ports. Because I look at it as I
A
want it to be
dock,
almost
too,
like a
yeah.
dock. If I'm having a box sitting on my desk, it better also have docking capability as well. And if it doesn't have that, then you're paying a lot of money for just the graphics card, and that's sort of it. So I think eGPUs, it's always been a super niche thing, and because the volumes aren't high, you're not going to see a lot of money put into R&D of that. Like you said, there's all sorts of bandwidth limitations with Thunderbolt. I don't think Thunderbolt 4 is really going to help us out drastically either in that
Again,
regards.
like we keep getting better connections with more bandwidth, but we also keep getting stronger graphics cards that need more bandwidth.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think you're right in that it seems that discrete graphics in notebooks has kind of killed the need for an eGPU. You will always find niche use cases where an eGPU makes some sort of sense. But all of the complication around driver problems, and early on they weren't really plug and play and this and that, and it's like the whole thing felt a little duct tape at the very beginning, and it's gotten a lot better than where it started, but it's still not quite there for it to be just a seamless plug and play experience for me to say, yep, if you want that set up, go for an eGPU. Because fundamentally I always say just go for a good desktop and a thin and light notebook. If you can buy an older Spectre or an XPS on sale, I think that's sort of the sweet spot.
Jessica writes in and says, do you think the trend of OEMs such as Dell and Lenovo shipping laptops with Linux, and I know HP used to do that too, is there a market niche created by MacBook moving to ARM for them? Or I don't know. I guess the question is, do you think Linux as a standard shipping operating system from OEMs will increase, stay the same, or it's just kind of a thing that pops up every now and then?
It's a good question. I think it'll stick around. I don't see Linux fundamentally getting better. It would be nice to have more choice in the desktop operating system space. It's really Windows or nothing. And Windows does some things really well and does lots of things really badly.
We were talking about it before we started.
Oh my God.
The problems I have to deal with some of these months. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah. So Linux is important for some users. As much as people will love to tell you, I don't think Linux is still quite there yet for the average user. And I think fundamentally because it just doesn't have the sheer amount of share in the market. If you Google laptop problems, you get answers to Windows PCs and how to fix problems via Windows. Linux has the issue where not just what flavor of Linux, but what version of Ubuntu or whatever you're using, right? I kind of wanted to see Ubuntu succeed. Not that I really care for Linux personally, but it would just be nice to have more choice. But it seems that long term, Windows isn't going away.
I was ranting about this on my last live stream. I really think our best chance is if SteamOS really would have taken off and they just charged $10 for it. Because you need a multi-billion-dollar company to take a version of Linux, in my opinion, and make it work with tech support and just turn it into a competitor to Windows. And people will say, oh, Ubuntu is. It's like, it's not. It is not. It is not comparable. I'm sorry, guys. And I use Linux in college all the time for all different types of applications like Mathematica and stuff. And so I know how to use Linux. I'm telling you, for the normal person, it's not there. And I really think Valve could have done it if they put in the effort. But I think they were just kind of playing chicken with Microsoft.
Yeah, it definitely, Steam machines kind of came and went quite quickly.
Yeah, quicker than I thought they would. Even I wasn't sure they'd even do well.
I didn't think it was really going to go anywhere. It was an interesting idea, but I sort of looked at it and was like, gamers aren't crying out for an alternate solution. Maybe businesses might down the track. I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting. Although on the flip side, using gaming as like a lever to increase market share of that kind of Linux-based product would have been very interesting. Yeah,
I think they could have done it. They just did not see it through at all.
That's a fun thought exercise. If Steam OS was suddenly this third
real
sort of
competitor, yeah. I think it'd be better if it was, and I'm still mad at them, as you can tell from the tone of my voice. All right, I have one more question here. Griff Dilla Griff writes in and says, any news of OLED screens being cheap enough and better at resisting burn-in? Are we getting closer, or will OLED never be standard in laptops? Well, I think you see in the notes, I just ordered an OLED laptop and I only paid $1,400, Griff Dilla Griff. So I'm seeing OLED becoming much more standard in laptops soon. But what would you say?
I would say, just this is my personal view. From what I've seen, I've had the same laptop side by side, same model. One was standard 4K LCD, high quality 4K LCD. The other was the 4K OLED. Unless you had like a very dark black picture, which is what OLED is good for, you couldn't really notice a huge difference, right? Now, it's fundamentally different on like a TV, where you can push up the nits and all that in terms of the brightness, because you can draw a lot more power and everything else. But in a laptop...
So the black's more obvious.
Yeah, but in a laptop, power efficiency is really important. OLED screens are great, but they suck a lot of power.
Isn't that funny too? Because I remember when they first started talking about OLED in 2012, one of the big things was, and they're so efficient. And then, I don't know. They seem to use a lot of energy.
They're efficient maybe versus plasma, but definitely not versus
everything
typical.
Is.
Yeah. Pour one out for plasma. What a great technology, but it had its issues. When it comes to OLED, though, there are fundamental problems around power usage that are not going to go anytime soon. Not to mention that there's only, I think, Samsung is the only, was it Samsung?
LG.
LG. Yeah, LG's really
Although
the
Samsung's
only...
going to soon, so that will help with the pricing competition soon.
Yeah,
because Samsung was kind of doubting OLED, and now OLED is taking over the high-end TV market pretty rapidly, and phone. And I think Samsung's realized they should take it seriously. So just to be clear, I'm a huge proponent of OLED.
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to when you hit a certain point in the contrast and how good it is for the average person. Do you care if it's above a certain point? Professionals sure as hell do. But to the average person, no, they care about, is my laptop going to get me that 8-10 hours advertised, and is it going to be thin and light, and can I get it under $1,200? Which is the thing, right? I didn't set out to get an OLED, but I got one on the way that was $1,400 and has like an 8-hour battery life. So it's like, hey, I guess it's. I think it just launched actually, and I got a deal because, I still have a company discount technically active from when I used to work at one company. So I don't know when I see but I think even new without the discount, it's like $1,500 or something. When I see a $1,500 kind of mid-range gaming laptop, equivalent gaming laptop it's actually the new NV15 with an OLED screen, I go, oh, okay, well, they're coming down in price though. You have to admit that, I think. Because they used to only be in like $2,000 laptops. $1,500 is pretty cheap. Yeah, they seem to be available at more price points and more levels. So, look, at my heart, I'm a technologist. I love technology in all its forms. I would love to see OLED proliferate everywhere, and mini LED, micro LED, all these standards. Let's have it take off, because LCD panels haven't really, again, when we talk about stagnation, they haven't changed a lot since we moved to LED backlit displays, right? They haven't changed a lot in the last 10 years. So it's overdue for a lot of those innovations in the television space to translate over to PC monitors at a decent price point, because it's easy to do in a TV that's $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, but in a PC monitor that's $250. That's a different challenge. Right.
But here's the thing with laptops, they turn their screens off regularly and you replace them every 2 years. So I actually think AM OLEDs are going to be much more prevalent in laptops than you would think, fairly soon. I mean, when I see them coming into laptops for under 1,500, I go, oh, well, this used to be this insane thing. It's just keep in mind, they don't look quite as good. Like my laptops won't look as good as my LG TV. It's not going to. And it works well in a laptop compared to a desktop because the screen turns itself off every few minutes, right? So burn-in really isn't as much of an issue. I guess that's my answer, is I think it's going to be more prevalent in laptops than you might think. It's not going to be the standard in laptops, probably ever, because of how cheap and energy efficient, like you said, right, LCD is. And when it comes to desktops, honestly, I'm becoming less and less optimistic on how long it's going to take for them to finally give us 27-inch OLEDs or micro LEDs.
Exactly.
All right, well, I think that's all the questions that we have time to get through. We've been talking for quite a long while here. As usual, the time just flies by. But, before we go, I guess let me ask you this. First of all, is there anything else you wanted to discuss that we didn't get to?
Not really. I think we touched on a pretty wide range of topics, really. So, I'll leave everyone with, I'm very excited to see what AMD is going to bring out at the end of this month in terms of graphics. We've seen their CPU announcement. We've seen GPUs from NVIDIA. We've got GPUs from AMD yet to come out. We've got Rocket Lake coming out early next year. So there is a lot of...
Maybe Intel's going to announce a graphics card lineup in Computex. Maybe I know that.
Maybe. Who knows? Who knows? But it's a very exciting time, I think, to be in IT.
Oh, God, yes. It's so much more interesting than 5 years ago when you're like, what lake are we on?
Yeah, exactly. I'd say there's a lot more innovation from a CPU point of view than we've seen. We've seen a lot of stagnation there, and it's awesome to see we're getting back to I like to call the good old days where you can expect a 15 to 20% performance improvement sort of gen to gen on the CPU side.
Or
I think
more.
everyone's
yeah, it's insane. And then if you wait 3 years, you can upgrade to something that's like 2-3 times better.
It would actually make everyone's been numbed to getting used to 10% or less performance improvements,
Oh, yeah. And that's what how I end a lot of these podcasts is I say, I know people go, when should I wait to upgrade to get this one thing that'll last 10 years? And I just that's like banging my head on a wall. Guys, the era of getting Sandy Bridge and it lasts 10 years is over. Things are just going to keep getting better. So maybe try to time it right. You have a big AMD launches coming over the next fall. So maybe if you want to wait till spring, that would be a good idea. But the idea of you waiting a couple of years for the perfect time to upgrade is kind of dead for a while now.
There's a bit of fallacy in that thinking of, I'll just wait for the next thing just around the corner. I'll just wait for the next thing just around the corner.
I know. Wait for Zen 3. What about Zen 4?
Exactly right.
What about Zen 5 when you get Zen 4?
So something you were discussing with your brother on one of your recent podcasts about just buy the best of the previous gen. And I think that's a very solid advice because
if it's cheap enough, but it's often less than half the price.
Exactly. So it's like, why on earth would you spend so much extra money when you can get 80 to 90% of the same performance for half the price? Just
unless you want the best, then
unless you want the best, it's your money. Spend it like you want. But I say the same thing around cars with friends of mine. I say, let some other poor schmuck take all the depreciation in the first couple of years.
I just got a car and just, it's a 2019 model and letting it compared to the 2020, or I guess now we're almost to 2021s with some companies.
Yeah.
It's literally half the price of the new one. No, I agree. So I think let's close out on that little piece of advice. And I don't know. Otherwise, thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time.
The following podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother, Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, and select technical editing by Carbon Cry. You can find all of our information, including how to get a hold of us, at www.mooreslawsdead.com. And if you are a fan and would like to send mail or other hardware, please mail parcels to Moore's Law's Dead, P.O. Box 10468, Peoria, Illinois 61612. And speaking of fans, without exaggeration, the patrons are responsible for the continued distribution of the content you just listened to. And so if you have some extra money, but only if you do, please consider supporting us. For just $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to have your questions read aloud on Broken Silicon, Die Shrink, and Loose Ends, and of course, the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who would love to meet you. I am one of them. And at higher tiers, you get access to ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the back catalog of Flyover States podcast, thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts, and other perks as well. And if you cannot afford to support us, please just share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family on social media and Reddit. And give Broken Silicon and Flyover States a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. All of this really does help so much more than I think anyone realizes. If you'd like to advertise on the podcast or a person of interest who would like to be a guest, please reach out to the email address mlhbdead@gmail.com. But as I said, this podcast would not be possible without its fans supporting it. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher producer levels:
Matthew McMullen, Tello, Steen, Benny Berlin, Justin Yant, Thomas Rupp, I Love You, Lynn and Jim Bollocks, Joshua Albin, Muhammad Al-Kawari, Frederick Lau, James Crassa, Justin Parrish, Zachary Martin, Terrence Herod, Brad Bedlin, Phil S., Courtney Elliott, The Ninth Dude, Greg Renegar, TSPCFS, Chrysantine, Night Rogue 77, The Mechanical Philosopher, Libo King Kilo, Fatboy Diesel, Daniel Hyde, D. Kunke, Christoph Novak, Jack O'Neill, Matt Salem, Aaron Close, Juan Garcia, VI Pass, Sadler, Isaiah Gosner, Lethros, Telos, Hey There's a Kitty, Greg T. Wanchik, Jacob Barber, Exodi, Hector Santana, Matthew Lane, Joe McMorrow, Jan Rauner, Rubber Duck, Street of Full, Ali Robertson, Eric Jackson, Jonathan, Job, Evan Dingle, Dominique Cox, Stefan, Original Ross, Zedia Tech, Zam MacArthur, Total Silo, Sol Connor, Michael Costa, Andrew S., Blake, Aaron Keith, Kerry Baldino, Endless Logins, Tom Senfilippo, Justice Brennan, Ivan K., Trevor Power, Sayonara, Alenya, Joshua Staveness, Daniel Nishbal, Franco Frederic, Hardware Numbers, Alex Carastillo, Dark Rain 2049, Leighton Perry, Joseph Kyerman, Carlos Valdez, Carnivore Bear, Marco 226, Zabra Z. Burr, Zlicky, Matt Parshagi, David Cowden, Ricky Tan, Garanadin, Patrick J.S., Justin Staples, Freddie Canoas Jr., Christoph Foster, Kiwi Phil, Joaquim Hagan, Sarah Light, Anthony Garefa, Matthew Griffin, Alex, Joseph Loria, Calm Marco, Deke, Cheesy Ramen, Raul Abeneni, Master Andy Wan, Jake Dude 23, Brian Riggleman, Maxime Bratukin, Ryan Danescu, Dave McCoy, Falco Malev, Messiers, Paul Bogdan, Morton Svensson, Andrew Thomas Summers, Maurice Courtois, Matthew J. Link, Mose from Oz, Mai Sharona, Derek File, Roman, Jacob Stankiewicz, Jack Pym, Austin Tanis, JBG, Stefan Hart, Christopher A. Butler, Charles Antoine Fouteau, Peter Moore, Chris Licata, Justin Thomas, Sam Miller, James Kitchens, Kevin Chen, Shinkir, Dean Dispitsky, Paul J., My Name is Nobody, Ruben Marr, Luis Correa, John Jamison, Eshel Dar Epson, and Luca. And of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.